Canada's most populous province is about a month away from going to the polls. The PCs are looking to continue in power, while the official opposition, the NDP, is looking to build on its previous success. The Liberals, well, they're trying to find their way out of the woods after being reduced to a rump party. Which way will voters go this time? Hello and welcome to Unpublished TV. I'm Ed Hand. 4 years after Doug Ford landed at Queen's Park, he's looking for another mandate. The party's just announced platform comes with some big spending, more than $198 billion. A return to balance will be further down the road. The NDP platform focuses on healthcare with promises of more nurses and PSWs, although there's no price tag on that. The Liberals have announced a pay transparency plan and a before and after school care plan to run in line with the Fed's child care plan. Our Unpublished.vote question asked you, if the election was held right now, which party would you vote for? 50% said the PCs, 20% said the Liberals, 15% the NDP, and 15% the Green Party. However you're watching and listening to our show, whether through our social media channels on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, or podcast channels, iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and more, I'd like to remind you, you can still cast your vote on this topic at Unpublished.vote and then email your MP to tell them why. Joining us to discuss the upcoming election, Darrell Bricker, CEO of Ipsos Public Affairs, Tom Parkin, political commentator, and Carl Narenberg, columnist with Rabble.ca. And we'll start off with Darrell first. From your work, healthcare and pocketbook issues have the mind of the electorate. Which party, at this point, do you say is poised to address them?
Well, if you ask Ontarians who would do the best job on healthcare, it's pretty clearly the NDP that's out in front on that. And by the way, healthcare is the number one issue when we ask people about the most important issue. Second issue is management of COVID. And on that issue, we find that the Liberal Party is ahead. But then everything after that is all the Conservatives. And it all relates to inflation, cost of living, housing, all of those issues. The Conservatives have a pretty good lead on those. So it really comes down to, what's this election going to be about? Is it going to be about COVID? Is it going to be about the future of healthcare? Or is it going to be about issues like inflation and the cost of living? And depending on what the election becomes about, either of the three parties could dominate.
Tom, it seems the anyone but Ford movement is growing, and you had an interesting piece in the Toronto Star this week, and you feel there doesn't need to be an alliance between the Liberals and the NDP. Why is that?
Well, my thinking, Ed, was that, I'm not against having a pact. That's a totally legitimate thing, and that can have good outcomes. But, I don't want to age myself, but I do remember a time before Mike Harris when the legislature used to operate in a very different way. And MPs would serve on committees. Committees for the legislature were more robust. They would have more people from the public, from community groups, interest groups, lobby groups, who would make presentations. They would even travel the province to hear, what they think in Sarnia, what do they think in Sault Ste. Marie, what do they think in Cornwall. I think that and another interesting thing about that is that it also forced MPPs to socialize. Because you'd be in Sarnia and you'd have your hearings, then you'd go for dinner and you have a drink, and then you go to the hotel and see everybody at breakfast. So, there's a camaraderie that kind of comes with travel. I think we can all relate to that. And I think this is something that's really missing from our politics today. So my piece for the Star was really making the argument that a pact about certain policies is good, but my argument was that we've gone too far in the direction of centralization of power in the Premier's office. That power, Mike Harris really centralized things, and they never were fixed. And so, would it be possible, or who might have the interest in giving power back to the legislature, letting MPPs having a little bit more sway, and letting the legislature govern a bit more effectively, rather than having to come into these pacts that are, written between leaders' offices only.
Carl, for the Liberals and the NDP, it seems the desire to get rid of Doug Ford and the PCs is their primary concern, as opposed to presenting policies and getting into discussion. It's not enough just to dislike Doug Ford, is it?
No, absolutely not. You have to have something to present. In defense of the NDP, they came up with a platform. It is very high level. It touches on all kinds of bases. It has some interesting possibilities, but it's really, and this has become a problem, I think, for the NDP federally as well, it's really lacking in granular detail and lacking in figures and lacking in how do we get from here to there, and sometimes really resorts to vague generalities so that anybody could say it. Whereas the Conservatives have a budget, I mean, just to correct what you said a second ago, the Conservatives haven't put out their actual election platform, but they put out something in a way is better. It's a budget, so that it's got all the details and all the figures. Well, actually, even budgets can be vague on a number of points, and the budget fudges a number of points and makes some general observations. The Liberals have put out a few individual in the window policies. Aside from the ones you mentioned, the Liberals talk about banning handguns for the whole province. My friend Irvin Waller here, an eminent criminologist, says, "Well, thinks that's a wrong-headed view. He doesn't favor handguns, but he doesn't think it's possible. He doesn't think it'll work, and he thinks he talks about upstream crime prevention, which the Liberals were once committed to as being more effective." I think that as the campaign goes on, I do think they're going to start trying to roll out policies, both the NDP and the Liberals, and I really hope they do, and I certainly hope that the NDP goes further than a platform without any numbers in it, that they start putting numbers to it, and they start making announcements with specific numbers and contrasting themselves, what they plan to do with what the Conservatives have already announced. We know in some areas, for instance, they would get rid of the 1% freeze on public service salaries, especially nurses and healthcare workers. They have to start talking about those issues, and they have to start talking also about where they stand on the economy and economic development and encouraging industry such as the car industry.
You know, Daryl, when I look at the PC's campaign literature, doesn't seem to mention the NDP at all, just Stephen Del Duque and well, tying the connection to Kathleen Wynne. At this point, are the Liberals the PC's top concern, or is it still the official opposition?
It's. I think that there's a kind of a reflex belief that the Liberals represent their biggest challenge. But the first stage of this campaign will really not involve the Conservatives very much at all. I mean, the first stage of this campaign will be which party becomes the champion for the progressive voters in the province of Ontario. We saw that very much in the last election campaign as well. That NDP and Liberals were fairly even, and then the NDP took off, and you saw the Liberals drop like a stone. I think there's potential that you could see a similar dynamic this time around, because the splitting of the vote is something that really hurts both of those parties. So I think the first stage of this campaign is going to be really a competition, evaluating the two potential replacements for Doug Ford. And then the question is whether they'll have enough time at the end of it to really effectively compete with him. One of the things that's really surprised me is the low level of interest in this campaign, the low level of intensity in the campaign, just as the Conservatives would like it, I suspect. And by the way, on the question of platform, Doug Ford didn't even release a platform in the last election campaign. So it'll be interesting to see what they do this time. But it seems to me at the moment to be a pretty low intensity campaign. The real interesting action will be on the left of the political spectrum, not on the right of the political spectrum. And then if they can get that sorted out, then the question is which party is really going to challenge Doug Ford. And this creates a very good scenario for Ford, I think.
Tom, how does the NDP build on its results and that success getting to the official opposition from 2018?
Well, it's got 40 incumbent seats. So it's obviously a key piece is to make sure that those 40 seats are secure. The NDP has a lot more money than it's ever had before, and it's got far more staff than it's ever had before, and MPPs. It's got the power of incumbency. So those campaigns, when the election is called, I would assume the NDP is going to put a pretty strong emphasis on having those up and going very, as fast as possible to show people in those communities that this is a campaign that intends to get their person reelected. So, getting the signs up quick, making sure that things are, all of the visibility of a local campaign makes it clear to residents how that's going to go. And then there's 10 other seats where the New Democrats lost to the PCs by less than 5%. These are places like Sault Ste. Marie, Brantford, Scarborough, I'm going to say Scarborough Centre. I might be mistaken on that.
Ottawa West is another one.
Ottawa West, Nepean, Brantford West, I believe. At any rate, there's 10 of them. 5%. So that's 2.5% of the population switching from PCs to NDP, and those could be wins. So that gets you to 50. Then you might actually kind of secretly not be all that unhappy if the Liberals might sneak up a little bit. And you're of course looking at the next tier of people beyond that. So that's the way I see the campaign going for the New Democrats. That's where they're going to have to focus. But it's a tough. They have a tough challenge, because I think a lot of people instinctively in Ontario believe that if you want to vote out Conservatives, that means you vote Liberal. This is what we've been trained to do since forever. But now this time it's a little different dynamic. So Horwath has got a job to convince people, to re-educate people, if you will, about what the political situation is. Her leadership, the Liberals have 7 seats, and their leader doesn't have a seat, and really directly put the case forward that she's the one who can defeat Doug Ford. But she also has a secondary argument, which I think is interesting. It's not just defeat Doug Ford; it's also her back half is to fix what's been broken, which goes, I think, to the point that Carl makes: is you got to have something, especially to be in relief to the Liberals, to say we're not just going to defeat Doug Ford, but we also got to fix our healthcare system. We got to fix our LTC system. We got to fix our transit systems. All these things that not just under Ford, but under the Liberals before, decayed and became somewhat broken. So she's got as pointed out, the progressive primary off the top. If it's not resolved in time, then Mr. Ford will be walking away. But if it can be resolved, I think we saw last time that by about the May 24th long weekend, the New Democrats were actually ahead of the PCs in the polling, and then there was a reversal at the very end. So can be done. Will it be done? Well, I guess stay tuned, right?
Yeah, no kidding. Carl, you recently wrote, you've never been so frustrated about an election than you are with this one. Why is that?
No, I don't know if I wrote that, but I would say I was frustrated because in this country, the provinces are where the rubber hits the road. If people who care about stuff that government does for you, the water that comes out of your tap, municipal, but the municipalities are creatures of the provinces, the kind of housing you're going to have, the kind of air you breathe every day, your education, your healthcare, your roads, your services. It's the provinces. We have such an obsessive focus on the theater of the federal government, and yet oddly, in this country, the federal government has really, really high-level big picture. I mean, their main constitutional responsibilities are the currency, foreign affairs, military, and anything that crosses provincial boundaries. For instance, the federal government, believe it or not, is responsible for the transit drivers of Ottawa and Gatineau because the buses cross the border, but they have nothing to do with the transit drivers in the rest of Ontario. And yet we give short shrift to provincial politics here in every province except for, guess which one? Quebec. In Quebec, when news announcers talk about in the country today, dans le pays aujourd'hui, they don't mean Canada, they mean Quebec. The only place where provincial stories will lead the national news is on the French news on Radio Canada or on the private stations. Here, we just don't cover it that well. I give my friends at CBC Radio, and they do their radio noon, and they do often do provincial stuff, but we ignore provincial politics too much, considering how much more important most of what the provinces do for the ordinary citizens is than what the federal government does. I mean, do you really care about the currency that much? I mean, it's sort of important, but it's not next to whether or not you're going to get treated in the hospital if you get sick.
Daryl, I want to follow up on what you said, that the low interest in this election camp. It's not underway just yet. It's pretty darn close, though. Is that election fatigue because we had the 2 federal elections, or is this COVID fatigue, or is just everybody frustrated with everything and they've got better things to do?
Well, when you break down the numbers and you take a look at how they're evaluating what's coming forward, the Ontario public is evaluating things. The vote numbers they're a bit of a meringue and a fiction right now. They're affected by what people think of the federal brands, but all sorts of things. But when you go a little deeper on that, you see that level of satisfaction with the provincial government's actually quite high, certainly higher than it is for the federal government. When you take a look at Doug Ford's personal approval numbers, he's way ahead of the opposition leaders. So it's not like people are really feeling a huge need to get at him. And that's what drives interest in the election campaign, the sense that there's going to be a change, or there's potential for change. And at the moment, people in Ontario neither expect there will be a change or have a really strong desire for change. And this is what reduces the likelihood that they'll show up or they'll even be interested in the campaign, is they don't really think there's much going on here. And that's the big challenge, obviously, for the opposition leaders, because they've got to generate some interest in this campaign. And so far, it's pretty tough to do when people are watching, the inflation rate every day, and they're watching, what's going on in Ukraine, and they're, worrying about a whole bunch of other things. It's pretty tough to get them interested in this election campaign. And that's to the detriment of the opposition parties.
And then, Tom, one of the best ways to get attention is through debates. Are we expecting many leader debates that we're going to see before the election, or
not? There was a town hall by the Pay Equity Committee, sponsored by the Pay Equity Committee. I guess it was about 10 days ago, and then we're going to have the Northern debate on the 10th of May, and the consortium, the network consortium debate is going to be on the 16th of May. So there's definitely chances for opposition leaders to land punches, to make people remember what they don't like about Mr. Ford. But Mr. Ford has also been somewhat effective recently at, folksying up his image, and kind of making people laugh and forgetting that it's about politics. So I imagine he'll try and, as much as Daryl said in both debates, he'll try and low profile it. He'll be happy if Ms. Horvath and Mr. Del Duca duke it out, and he can stand back and just throw the occasional jive at them about how, oh, this will be a terrible place to live if either one of you guys get to be premier. So, he'll just do that kind of peripheral damage, drive-by stuff, unless something happens and he's on the hot seat. So there's time to make that happen. But I think, and again, to Daryl's point about the quietness, Mr. Ford has been, I think, in his campaign, have been quite careful about trying to keep the level of engagement down in the weeks leading up. Not too many press appearances, not too many press conferences. Keep it fairly quiet from their perspective. Don't mess with anything. Leave it as it is.
Carl, the Conservatives have some big boots to fill here. Rod Phillips and Christine Elliott will not be running in this election. What's that loss going to mean for the party?
Well, I mean, things are so leader focused these days that I'm sure there's a high proportion of people in Ontario who couldn't tell you who either of those were, even though Christine Elliott had a lot more history with the party than Doug Ford. I think they have enough bench strength at least to present credible candidates. I mean, they have a very unfortunate finance minister whose name nobody can pronounce. I mean, he himself has difficulty pronouncing his own name. If you can say it, good for you. I'm not even going to dare. But he's a pretty good communicator. But the fact is that the last campaign, either federal or provincial, that I can remember that featured a team was 1993 federal campaign, the Jean Chrétien campaign. He won that campaign. The Liberals were worried that he seemed way too much like yesterday's man. And you remember he ran holding a picture of the Red Book with his team that included Paul Martin together. We have the team, we have the policy, we have the program. They kept saying the team. They kept emphasizing the team. And Ford has somewhat emphasized the team as well when his popularity waned a bit, but I think he won't be that tempted to do it this time, and will more emphasize that we're past the worst stuff. We piloted the ship of state, the ship of Ontario government through the pandemic, and we made it. And Ford is lucky in a way. People seem to have short memories. of the biggest disaster, which was long-term care and the healthcare system in general, and how the healthcare system really couldn't cope, and how even now there's shortages and fears. But somehow, just one final thing. I mean, his approach is very different from people you'd say were in his big political family looking south of the border, like Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, or Greg Abbott, the governor of Texas. Their approach is always divide and conquer, sharpen differences, sharpen divisions, find scapegoats and enemies, gay people, immigrants, whatever. That is not, Doug Ford's a Canadian after all. Doug Ford's a conservative and a populist right of center conservative, but he's still a Canadian. What he's trying to do is present a more consensual approach. Amazing how much he's talking about green energy and the environment after having canceled the rebate for electric cars. Now they're investing in them. So, I think the hope for the opposition has got to be, to go back to that other issue, has got to be that somehow enough people who lost people in long-term care, or who feel that their management of the healthcare system and long-term care system was so bad, and of education, by the way, has been so bad, that they're going to wake up and start getting angry as they get closer to the ballot box. But, that may be a long shot.
Daryl, when we spoke last week, we were talking about this, and what doesn't make your top five as issues was housing. But you feel that could still sway the election. Do you still feel that way?
Well, it's definitely in the top five. I mean, the difference on housing this time around is that it's not the usual place that housing sits in an election campaign, or even in any of our issues polling, where it's about low-income housing, helping the homeless. What's really emerged is the lack of access to middle-class housing. And this is a real vulnerability for the government. And the reason for that is the people who are feeling this issue the most are the people who are the biggest swing voters in the province, and that's suburbanites. People who are commuting suburbanites who feel that they're being denied what all the things that they've done well in their life. The payoff for this is supposed to be your own patch of land with your own driveway in your own backyard. And it's become all but inaccessible for most people living, particularly in the GTA these days, increasingly in places like Ottawa, London, and other places. And it's interesting when you go in on every other issue, it's really clear who the party is, who's the leader. On this one, it isn't. And it is in the top five. So there could be some noise around that. The other thing I would add to all of this, and this speaking directly to what Carl's saying, because he's raised a really interesting point, and both Tom has too, on the leadership question. If we were having this election in the first year of Doug Ford's mandate, he would have got creamed. The COVID pandemic has completely transformed his profile with Ontarians, for good or for bad, however you want to look at it. But that chippy, going after the progressive focus that he had in that first part of his mandate has all but evaporated. And he's become very much a centrist type of politician. I don't want to say Bill Davis, but in a similar kind of vein, and has that type of profile with Ontarians right now. It's really quite bizarre, the degree of transformation he's gone through. Justin Trudeau, interestingly enough, did not go through that transformation. He was, affected deeply by the previous election campaign, got even worse in this election campaign. He's got through this complete cycle of, darling to disappointment to dislike, and people are just through with him. Doug Ford's kind of gone in the other direction, and it's shocking, because if you would have asked me in his first year of leadership whether he had a chance of possibly getting reelected, I think I would have put my money on no, because he was in a really tough spot. But right now, he's the horse for the course, and he's doing really, really quite well with Ontarians, shockingly well.
He just has to be, I guess, managed and handled so he doesn't do anything wrong.
Well, actually, I disagree with you on that, Ed.
Okay.
I think that actually his more natural presentation, as opposed to the federal government Justin Trudeau approach, which is the ask me anything and I won't answer it, I'll just spout out my talking line. His spontaneity is something that actually works for him. There's a genuine aspect to the way he presents himself in public that really is an interesting contrast to other types of politicians. Whether you like him or dislike him, people kind of respond to that presence. He's a rare kind of fish in politics. He's a guy who's comfortable in his own skin. And that's typically not what you get in overmanaged, over-directed types of politicians these days. And I think these troubled times actually set up more for that type of a presentation. It'll be interesting to see whether the real Andrea Horwath comes out or the real Stephen Del Duca comes out to be able to compete with that. Because this guy's at a different level in terms of the way he connects with people. And, you know, in the first part of his term, it was something that really kind of turned people off. He seemed to have learned. He's gotten better with it, and his presentation is actually quite effective. I don't think anybody's going to say, you know, qualify him for Mensa, you know, or anything like that. But there's an authenticity to him these days that actually works quite well for him.
Well, folks, a very interesting discussion. And as we said, we've got about a month away until we are going to the ballot box. But I want to thank our guests on Unpublished TV, Daryl Bricker, CEO of Ipsos Public Affairs, Tom Parkin, political commentator, and Carl Narenberg, a columnist with Rabble. And I want to thank you for watching Unpublished TV. Stay safe. I'm Ed Hand.